All right, so we're here with Governor Charlie Baker. This is the Standard-Times Editorial Board, and he's here in conjunction with his re-election campaign. We'll go through our rituals as we always do, and that is introducing ourselves around the table. I think the governor knows most everybody, but there might be a few people who don't know. I'm Jack Spillane, I'm the editorial page editor.
Beth Perdue, editor.
Gary Goen, senior multimedia copy editor.
I'm Jeanette Barnes, I'm a reporter.
Billy Penman with the campaign.
I'm sitting for the Department of Revenue. I'm on the board here.
Shane Trimble, I'm a citizen member of the editorial board and director of transit planning for SRTA.
Okay.
Okay, so we'd like to make a little presentation for a few minutes first.
Well, I would just start first of all by thanking you for giving me this chance to chat today. I think the three big things the Lieutenant Governor and I said we were going to work on when we ran was, number one, sort of restoring the relationship between the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth cities and towns. And a big part of our administration has been about doing that. And whether it was the municipal modernization law or the community compact program or the move to push significant amounts of transportation funding and other funding sources into local delivery models, whether it's Chapter 90 or the Small Bridge Program or the Complete Streets Program, or the work that we've done around municipal vulnerability planning, again, which is sort of community-centric and not driven to some extent by us, but in conjunction with our colleagues in local government. And our housing initiatives, which have almost all had fairly heavy local government involvement. A big part of the way we've thought about what we're supposed to do here is to help communities help themselves. And the second thing we said we were going to do was focus on what I call sort of a collaborative approach to governing. And I think the bipartisanship on many issues, on energy and environmental policy, on economic development policy, on most of the work we've done on opioids. I mean, in the end, both those big bills we did got sort of universal support. I think they each passed in their final versions unanimously, although there was a lot of back and forth between us and the legislature on both of those as we worked them through. And most other issues has been built on this idea that we're supposed to collaborate, we're supposed to cooperate, you know, let's get with everything we want out of the process. And the third thing is to work with our colleagues in local government to help make investments that are going to help them improve their quality of life, the quality of their schools, and the quality of their economic circumstance. And on most of those initiatives, we've seen progress. And the work is certainly not done. We have a long way to go. But when I look at where we were 4 years ago and where we are now, on most of the metrics associated with that stuff, there's been significant improvement. And I think our interest is in building on that improvement over the course of the next 4 years. I continue to believe that some of the issues that dominated the past 4 years, the opioid issue, for example, some of the issues around downtown and housing development, and some of the issues around transportation are not going away. But I also think this work we've been doing on municipal vulnerability planning around climate change has really big implications for both the strategies and the approaches we take to deal with those issues on a go-forward basis. And many of the communities of the South Coast have actually participated pretty aggressively with us on that. We look forward to working with them on part two, which is, okay, once you do the vulnerability planning, what's the hazard mitigation strategy look like, and how do we move that forward?
So I'm sure you won't be surprised if we start off with a topic that is very dear to us down here, which is offshore wind. And I'm just wondering, given all the pieces that have happened already in Massachusetts, and obviously there's been great progress, do you still see Massachusetts as the leader in offshore wind, given how much progress other states now have made? Do you see another procurement coming fairly soon? How important do you think that is for the state to do another procurement quickly? And what would you do to speed up that process if you think so?
So let me start by saying that I am enormously proud of the work that was done here on this issue. And I say that for two reasons. The first is nobody thought you could get an affordable, sustainable offshore wind program up and running. And we did that. I mean, the price tag associated with the procurement that we did is literally 30% of what the price tag of Cape Wind was. And that initiative all by itself is what's created all this excitement up and down the coast. So, you know, nobody was jumping up and down to do offshore wind when the only sort of viable example of what it looked like was Cape Wind. The reason people are jumping up and down the coast now is because we proved something that needed to be proved by somebody, which is that a procurement well run with an opportunity for the bidders to amortize the expense associated with the actual installation over a long period of time, because the incremental expense associated with this is not that high, creating like a really competitive procurement led to some really terrific solutions around affordability. Now, I happen to think that the fact that we chased what I would describe as, you know, sort of federally available water on federal procurements, or federally leased properties with a relatively minimal impact on ground fishing and some of the issues associated with that, puts us in a really good position to go back out and do this again, which we've committed to doing. But I think some of the other folks who are trumpeting how much farther ahead they are than us, some of them are chasing projects in areas where I think the issues with respect to fishing are really big, and are going to crash into some pretty significant issues and consequences. And some of them aren't even in federally leased waters. So I think the planning and the setup work that was done on this was appropriate, and I'm pleased to discover that a whole bunch, you know, if imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, we've done something here in Massachusetts collectively that's really made an impact on the way people think about offshore wind generally, and I think that's terrific. And we certainly believe we should go out and chase the other 800 megawatts, and we will. But I want to make sure we get the first piece right, because it's getting it right that's actually created the enthusiasm and the momentum for other people to play in the space.
Ask a follow-up question on that. Deepwater Wind, when Rhode Island gave them the award for a project that was about half the size of our project, pledged $40 million in economic benefits to the Rhode Island communities that were interested in doing transport and all. Deepwater only pledged $10 million. In the next procurement round, should economic benefits be a bigger ingredient, or are we about right where we should be with that?
We're certainly going to talk about that. I want to make sure that we continue to deliver on one of the major things that makes this so interesting to people, which is the affordability issue. But yeah, that would certainly be part of the conversation going forward.
Can you talk a little bit more about why affordability is so important, just in terms of the electric market and consumers?
Because ultimately, everybody pays for it, and if you really want to create a sustainable industry out of this stuff, you got to be able to deliver it at a price. I mean, we already pay the highest electric rates in the country, and it does have impacts, especially on manufacturers. And you have a whole bunch of terrific manufacturers in this part of Massachusetts, and I would like you to continue to have a bunch of terrific manufacturers in this part of Massachusetts. And I just think it's got to be part of the. If it's not part of the dynamic, then you end up with what looks like a one-off instead of a replacement. And the way I think about it, I mean, part of what makes the hydro stuff interesting to me as well is they came in at a terrific price. And that's baseload capacity that can be used on either the electric side or the thermal side. And those are important. And the other thing I would say, Jack, and I do think this will develop over time, we've been spending money on storage and working with a lot of folks in the private sector on a variety of initiatives around storage. If we can really, I think storage has the potential to take offshore wind and solar to a completely different place, and it becomes part of the answer to peak period demand, which at this point is incredibly environmentally awful and economically terrible. And if we can start using storage on a large scale, then the opportunity to basically store when peak is low and the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, and then use it when we really need it, which is why we supported the Clean Peak standard in the legislation that got passed this past spring. That's a big opportunity to do two really important things with respect to how this market works and how the price point and the availability and the affordability of offshore wind generally fits into the rest of the mix.
Do you have any specific ideas about how you get that economic benefit to approach more River Island? Go ahead.
Well, part of it is the way you bid the deal, right? I mean, that's my understanding about how, I mean, they were, once we issued our award, people looked at the price point we got and said, wow. And then you had two entities, one Connecticut and Rhode Island, and one the players who didn't get the original bid, all looking for an opportunity to get into the action because of the price point that had been demonstrated on the procurement that we did. So they were kind of coming in second, which always, I think, in some respects, put people in a slightly different place with respect to stuff like that. There's more known, there's more, and a bit more opportunity. They're also paying more than we are.
When you talk about storage, are you talking about centralized storage locations or like a distributed home battery network?
My guess,
like the pilot they did in Vermont.
My guess is it's going to end up being a combination of both. I mean, New York has done some pretty interesting things with storage that is consolidated, not distributed. But Vermont and some other people have done some. I personally think we're going to end up with both. I think you're going to have distributed storage that people are going to use in their homes and in their offices, and I also think we're going to end up with sort of larger storage installations that can also be used to deal with things like peak. And I think that's a good thing, and I think it's coming faster than most people realize.
So sort of a transportation manufacturing / question specifically related to New Bedford Harbor. There have been some real wins for the city recently, just with mass development in State Pier,
Yep.
With dredging, but we're wondering about sort of a future project and how important on the state's radar is the New Bedford Fairhaven Bridge, the one that would allow, because of the way it opens.
The way it swings.
Right, it would allow a whole new area, not new, but the North Terminal areas to really be built up and to allow more manufacturing and business opportunities there. Do you think the state should prioritize that?
I think it's, look, I know enough about it to probably say more than I should, which means it's obviously on people's radar. I think we're doing a study on it right now.
I believe there is something in the works, yes.
Yeah.
And some of the questions are how wide it goes relative to the hurricane barrier that we have. So there are some specific issues, I think,
Yep.
on the table, but you know, it's a big project, right? And there are a lot of big projects down here. So I guess we're just sort of wondering where it falls on your radar in terms of support from the state.
Well, I wouldn't know much about it at all if it wasn't on the radar, and we wouldn't be doing the study if we weren't interested in determining what some of the issues and the price tags associated with those issues look like. And we get the fact that it matters a lot in the larger context of the value of the harbor overall.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe that the big issue is the size of the opening, and you
Right.
can't get some of these bigger ships to do bulk shipping to the north terminal parts of the harbor.
It also has something to do with how long it takes to spin, right? I mean, it's like isn't it like a 20-minute?
Yeah.
It's
It
like a
is
20-minute
a
spin.
20-minute
Yeah.
process, but that's not the way it's been framed to me by some of the people are concerned about it. But
It had more to do with the nature of the size of the opening.
I think it's both.
Depends
It's
who you
an old-
ask. The
yeah.
drivers care about the 20-minute wait, but the people involved in the harbor development care about
Economic
things.
Access to the upper harbor.
Well, it's certainly part of the whole conversation that also involves the dredging, which is the other part of the issue as well, which is also, I mean, part of the reason there's now a dredging program at the state level came out of the conversations we had with people down here about how important that was to the area.
And there's been some forward movement there.
Yep.
So, yes.
So your opponent, when he was down here, mentioned the Middleborough commuter rail route.
Yep.
And his perspective was that given the hour-and-a-half time when it was running at an optimum basis, that commuting time, while great to getting the project going, is not going to get us the commute to Boston that people are looking for. And he's emphasizing that he's supporting the Stoughton project, which is sort of in the future to be done. You can't apply for it any other way but then keep it Stoughton. But how realistic is the Stoughton project in your opinion? And does it need to be done eventually?
Well, the reason we call it Phase 1 and Phase 2, and the reason why we continue to work on the issues associated with Phase 2 is it's because we believe there's still a bunch of issues there that should be addressed and questions that need to be answered. But to tell you the truth, you know, as we started talking about this after we took office, I was just, and I think the secretary would back me up on this, I was just impatient. You know, when we did the update on it, it said 2030 and you know, and you got to do this and that, and it's going to take forever, and blah, blah, blah. I just, Jesus, I mean, we've been talking about this thing since I was working for Bill Well, for God's sake. Is there any other way out of this? And that led to a series of, well, you know, maybe if you turn right in Taunton and you go over to Middleborough, you pick it up, and then there's some issues up in the north. And I said, well, at least look at them and let me know whether or not that's a viable option, because I feel like people here have been waiting for this long enough. And they basically came back and said the issues that are of concern are all solvable, and it would finish 5 years earlier than the other proposal, and instead of being $3.5 billion, it's $1 billion. And when you're talking about two projects that combine, so the incremental expense of actually doing this piece of it to some extent, apart from Fall River and New Bedford up to Taunton, for all intents and purposes, you'd have to do under either project. So some of the expenses that are associated with this, you'd incur doing both of them. So I think from our point of view, this was a way to literally get the thing going. I just sort of feel like people have been waiting long enough.
And I think the reception has been that people on the South Coast appreciate that, and at least in New Bedford, the majority of them have gotten on board, but there is also some concern as to whether the state is really committed to Stoughton. And I was just interested in your thoughts about Stoughton. Does it work, or is it pie in the sky?
I don't think it's pie in the sky. I just think there's a whole ton of, I mean, Stoughton has already involved 60 permits of one type or another, with many, many, many more to go. And we're continuing to pursue that. But I couldn't stand the idea of waiting literally 10 years from the time I took office to something actually happening here. I was kind of in a we need to move faster mode on this thing. My phone never rings hardly.
I mean, if I could kind of follow up on the transportation, you're kind of in my wheelhouse right now. You know, your opponent has a pretty robust plan for transportation funding. I don't think it's feasible, considering it was going to be on the ballot, now it's no longer. So, but the problem we really have with transportation is that the mechanism for funding it is relying on the gas tax. So we have a gas consumption, and we're steadily moving away from fuel consumption to electric or more fuel-efficient cars, but we haven't changed the mechanism that we actually fund our roads and bridges and transit systems. So what do you see the future in, you know, have you been looking at alternative methods of funding transportation that moves away from gas tax and more towards something that looks like a, you know, per use tax, either by mile or tolling, or something more creative than, you know, filling up your gas tank and paying off that?
So we have a futures commission that's going to issue a report by the end of the year, and it's not the usual collection of people. It's a pretty wonky, nerdy bunch, actually. But the point here was to have a bunch of smart people who understood these issues around electrification, autonomous vehicles, and all, and where people are going to live and how they're going to get, where they're going to work, and sort of all of those various things. and come back and give us some recommendations on how to think about this and what would be the right ways to pursue it going forward. And I'm anxious to see that report. I will say I'm not much of a fan of vehicle miles traveled. I don't think it's fair to the people who live in rural areas to basically, I would argue in some respects, when you get into rural areas, the roads, people drive more, but there are fewer of them, and they probably do less damage to the roads overall than people who drive in more congested areas but don't drive as far. And typically the rural folks have less access to public transit of one type or another than the folks in the more proximate areas do, and they pay just as much as everybody else does for the other folks' roads and the other folks' public transit systems. So I'm more inclined to be thinking about alternatives that don't necessarily involve vehicle miles traveled. I think that's an awful tough one on the people who do most of the right things and just happen to live a long way away from a lot of other stuff.
What about a toll on the Southeast Expressway where the people in the South Shore, who are some of the biggest people who are users, commuters, don't pay, and the people in the western suburbs and on the North Shore, like yourself, do pay?
You know, my understanding is when people kicked this idea around, and this was admittedly a long time ago, they discovered that some of the issues, that would almost be impossible to get a permit environmentally. And the larger question became one about what other mechanisms might be available. And I think the success that people have had with the stuff on the turnpike around Open Road is pretty interesting. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of this report, because there are other ways to think about this too.
Are you sympathetic to that argument on justice that the people in the western suburbs have been paying forever, the people in the North Shore have been paying forever, the people in the South Shore have not?
You know, I've lived in the western suburbs and on the North Shore, so I'm certainly familiar with the arguments from both sides. Truthfully, my view is I got a heck of an improvement in my commute in and out of Boston when the Third Harbor Tunnel opened up. There's no question that people coming from the west got a big improvement as a result of the taking down of the artery and the removal of, the fact that you had to come in, go up onto the artery, and go off to get almost anywhere. There were definitely some legit benefits associated with that. But I do think the argument that the folks coming from the west made, which was that we should not be spending any of the money that's raised on that particular road on anything other than that road on a go-forward basis, was the right argument, and I support that.
You see public-private partnerships a future for transportation in the state?
The answer is yes. The problem is figuring out what kinds of models would work. Do you guys all know what PTC is, Positive Train Control? It's sort of like, it's a signaling system that connects the trains to the tracks, along the tracks, so that if, God forbid, a train starts to move at a high rate of speed, something happens to it, you can use PTC to actually slow it down so that you don't have an accident. I mean, there was a huge, terrible crash, I think, in Pennsylvania about 6 months after we took office on a road on a track that didn't have PTC in it. And the feds at that point just said, we're done being good sports about this. Everybody has to do this. But we basically installed PTC on almost all the commuter rail lines over the past 3 years with a limited amount of disruption in service. We've replaced hundreds of thousands of railroad ties with a moderate amount of disruption of service. Miles, the big investments that need, part of the reason why these investments weren't ignored but didn't happen is because you got to organize them in a way where you're doing them either between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning when you're not running, or you got to do them when, during periods when you actually have access to alternative means of transportation. And one of the things we got out of the contract that we negotiated with the Carmen's Union several years ago was they gave us the ability to use private operators to do alternative transportation when we were doing work on the rails. And so commuter rail and rapid transit. And so as a result, we were able to bring in private operators on a temporary basis to run routes for us while we were busy doing some of the work associated with different parts of this thing along the way. And if we spend $8 billion, by the way, it will be $5 billion more than we spent in any 5-year period. And I believe we're going to be able to do that. This past year's the first year they've ever spent $1 billion on the capital program. But we had to build that capital program and the human capital that comes with it to actually deliver it. And I do think that they're spending the money on the right things.
Can we talk a little bit about education? There are actually a couple issues of importance to this area as well as the rest of the state, but what we're wondering is, there was movement forward on that report about the foundation formula,
Yep.
and we're just wondering where you are on that, if you'll be pushing and leading both the House and Senate to come to some sort of agreement, and they weren't really able to do that last
Yep.
session. It's probably on both radar. Where are you on this? Will you be sort of leading the charge on that?
So, you know, first of all, fairness to the House and the Senate, and frankly us, I guess. The foundation budget went up by $900 million over the course of the past 4 years. And that was $500 million from the state's side and $400 million from the local sides. And that included a number of elements, the biggest of which was first time we made investments on the cost of health insurance. But there were other things in there too. There are 3 issues associated. Part of the reason I think the discussions between the House and the Senate didn't work out is because of when you tweak this formula, you have winners and losers, and when you have winners and losers, it creates all kinds of complexities with respect to getting this stuff done. So what we've been talking to the folks at DESE about is, are there ways for us to do things either through the formula or through the formula and through other means to support communities that have had more difficulty than others in delivering on the achievement issue? Because, you know, one of the things we should not forget here is we still have a state where overall our K-12 system is really good, and our challenge is enhancing the performance in a bunch of communities that simply don't play at the same level that some others do. And the good news there is most of them get most of their money from the Commonwealth, which makes it easier for us to think about how to deal with that. And that translates in my mind into 3 big things. One is the way the charter school reimbursement formula works, which for those communities in particular creates a whole different set of challenges than it does in most other communities. I mean, the highest performing communities in Massachusetts don't have a lot of charter schools to begin with. Most of the charter schools, to their credit, operate in places where the achievement gap is the most significant. And the formula has clearly been an issue for several years, and I think it exacerbates, I think it gets mixed up with some of the issues around the formula, the Chapter 70 formula generally. And that I do believe was one of the issues that created some of the heartburn with the legislature trying to deal with this, because, you know, they were talking about different ways of dealing with Chapter 70, and then the charter school thing would kind of come in over the top and create a whole new set of issues for them. So that's number 1, the charter school formula. Number 2, I think the Chapter 70 formula has some issues, but I think they relate more to ELL students and low-income students than they do to all students. And if you were to say to me, you know, where would we want to enhance the formula, it would be on those 2 categories.
Low income, not special needs?
Let's start with ELL and low income. Because the special needs thing, again, I would argue is not just a function of the Chapter 70 formula, but it's also a function of the circuit breaker, which is a different issue. And then the third thing is, I think the state should be putting money out to communities that are looking to improve their achievement, that are targeted to particular initiatives that people have talked about historically that work. Things like acceleration academies, things like after-school programming, things like professional development for teachers, especially in particular categories where they work either with special needs kids or ELL students or other kids who are having trouble sort of catching up. And make those initiatives things where there's sort of a shared sense of purpose and understanding about what you're trying to create. Some of this came out of conversations I had with Jim Pizer and Jeff Riley. And Jeff in particular thinks that if all you do is tweak the formula and you don't do some things with respect to some of these other issues, you're not going to get the kind of improvement people are looking for. I mean, he's a big believer that through some of these other initiatives around professional development, acceleration academies, and after-school programming, you can really target your efforts and your activities to particular students and to particular classes and particular grades where you think you have the biggest issues and where people should be really focusing their efforts. And he's been around urban education a long time and has been pretty successful at it, and I'm willing to buy into that.
Would that make any community, because it is sort of sometimes the communities that have a bigger low-income population that are struggling more to hit the achievement. So if you're doing it through the other means and not specifically through the formula, would that mean that any community in the state, no matter?
No, this would be designed to support communities.
Be framed that way.
Yes,
so that
absolutely.
Can you just briefly go back to the circuit breaker and how it applies to special ed, so our viewers who may not understand that just have some concept of what you're talking about?
Special ed is funded in a variety of ways. There's money that goes out through the formula to cities and towns, and then there is additional state aid that comes in over the top that covers roughly, if you're not at a certain level of state investment in special ed, which is usually put at around 75%, then the state comes in over the top and gets you up to the 75% mark if you're not getting there through the formula. And that's how the circuit breaker basically works.
How does the other means, the acceleration academies, the teaching professional development, the after-school program, how does that translate into funding for these communities? Do you just support the programs themselves and that's a benefit to the district, or because the foundation formula is sort of the base funding for everything, so it's not like a mandated use. Would these be sort of, here's your money for X and for Y, and you need to do specific things to?
I think when I've talked to the commissioner about this, what he's talked about is literally asking people to submit proposals on it. Because in different school districts, it's going to be for different things, but it's the sort of thing where if you did it that way, you'd want to track over time what things seem to be working, which grade levels, which kinds of problems, which kinds of kids, and then based on that, you make adjustments to it going forward. But part of his message, which is pretty consistent with what I've heard from a number of the parents groups who are particularly interested in this, is if it's all just straight to the Chapter 70 formula with no particular programming elements attached to it, especially around some of that sort of thing, there are real concerns about whether or not you're going to get the kind of movement and improvement that people would like to see. I would love to see, the other thing, I know the mayor down here has talked about it. I would love to see, and I advocated for this, but didn't get very far with the legislature. I would love to see us give school districts the ability to do more with empowerment zones. I mean, the simple truth of the matter is the schools in the Springfield Empowerment Zone are making progress, and the teachers are fired up about it, the administrators are fired up about it, and the kids are fired up about it. And the biggest thing I learned about how this works is if you're an empowerment zone school, instead of getting a line item from the school department in terms of what you're supposed to spend all your money on, you get a block grant. And you basically take the block grant and you, the school, teachers, administrators, figure out what you want to spend your money on. And some of the stuff they end up emphasizing is stuff like that. And it's turned out to be pretty powerful in terms of their ability. Now it creates, I actually invited the head of the Springfield Teachers Union to the State of the State last year to talk about it in my State of the State, because they really like it. And the sense of participation and control and urgency that comes with it is really clear when you talk to them. And the Dugan, which is one of the ones that's been doing it the longest, has made a ton of progress. I mean, they've gone 50-50 on both English and math, which 50% improvement in both, which a lot of people would have said would have been hard to achieve.
Nice. Just to clarify before we get off that, you mentioned the reimbursement formula for charter schools. Are you talking about rewriting that formula, or are you talking about fully funding it as it is now?
I think we probably ought to rethink it and come up with a different way of doing it, because it doesn't make anybody happy.
Any ideas on the table?
More to say soon. But it's definitely a problem.
Do you have a position on the 1,000 pupil expansion of Alma Del Mar in New Bedford?
I don't think it comes up before the Board of Education until maybe like January. I visited Alma Del Mar. I think it's a cool school. I think it does some really interesting work, but it bumps right into this whole conversation about the charter school formula. So I really want to come up with some way of dealing with this where every time a good performer tries to do more in a community, it doesn't become all about the money, which is where these conversations always end up. And I think it's really defeating.
4 years ago, you talked about fishermen during your campaign. Since that time, New Bedford's had some challenges in its ground fishery, in some upcoming ones and scallops. Do you have any feeling of what you accomplished the last 4 years on fisheries? What have you been able to get done?
I think the biggest thing, there are two things we were able to do. One is we got some technology available to do some of the video work on the ground, the ocean floor, with respect, in conjunction with SMAST and the scalloping industry, to do some analytics around that, which was important to them. We also have a big industry-based survey that we've been doing in conjunction with the ground fishermen up in Gloucester, which was really important to them. They simply felt like their industry was terribly aligned with what NOAA was claiming was going on in the Gulf of Maine. The three other things I would speak to is we finally have, for the first time, a fairly coordinated effort around marketing Massachusetts-based seafood. There's more to be done there, but at least the process has started. And I think two of the big things I would like to do going forward, and this isn't something we've talked to Greater New Bedford about yet, but I think there's opportunities for us. We've done the Skills Capital Grant Program, which has turned out to be a big win in terms of sort of direct investments in vocational and technical schools and key high demand programs, or in programs where they felt there was a big opportunity to move kids in a particular direction. And it's been incredibly successful. But I would love to see if we couldn't do some things with the boat tech schools around fishing and what the opportunities might look like there. The other thing I'm interested in is we did, as part of the bond bill this past year, one of the things we included in it was some legislation and some funding to work collaboratively with the cranberry growers around upgrading some of their vines, which in many cases are 100 years old and requires a different way of sort of nurturing and harvesting them than you see in more recent cranberry bogs. And this is a competitive issue with respect to Wisconsin, but it got me thinking about whether there's something we could do on modernizing and upgrading some of the folks who are part of the fishing fleet with respect to the technology that they use. The other thing I would love to do more with is processing. And we've done some preliminary work in this space, and we're pretty sure that there are ways that we could legally support through state dollars some of the public infrastructure that's associated with growing our processing capacity, which in both Gloucester and in New Bedford is a really big deal. And I think an opportunity to more.
I'm not sure I understand what that would look like. How do you, is it that the infrastructure with the processors, the companies that do the processing now, needs upgrading, or the fishing equipment?
It's more, well, with respect to the first part, it would be around modernizing, whether there are ways to support modernizing the fleet.
Okay.
The second one has more to do with the public. I mean, most of the processing stuff sits on public assets. It's typically on piers. And there are public assets associated with designated port authorities where you can incorporate public funding into upgrading and in some cases maintaining and modernizing some of that stuff too.
Can you go back to the marketing piece for a second? Because I think in this state, there's that indelible image of Gloucester and the fishermen and all of that. But yet, if you look at the numbers, New Bedford far outweighs any sort of landings that Gloucester has. And
You think?
yeah. So much of it comes through New Bedford, and I'm just wondering whether that seafood marketing for the state would include some acknowledgement or recognition of New
absolutely.
Bedford as.
Are you kidding? You have the largest scallop port in the world. Yeah, it's $1 billion.
Okay, it's just an
Yeah.
interesting thing in that unless you live in New Bedford or the surrounding area, if you asked most people in the state where they saw their fish coming from the state, I'm sure Gloucester would get a higher mention. So when you talked about marketing.
Well, they have pretty big, takes in pollock and haddock, redfish, less so obviously with cod. And those end up on a lot of people's plates, but so do scallops, and that's a huge market. And yeah, I don't see how you can talk about seafood in Massachusetts without talking about scallops in New Bedford. To somebody that.
Peter, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Jack.
And Peter, we missed you on the go-round, so if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Okay. Governor Peter Buse, President and CEO of First Citizens Federal Credit Union. Thank you for coming down. One thing, I have a question, and then I want to say thank you for your management leadership up in Lawrence, Andover, North Andover. Those poor people up there are still having it tough, but it would be much worse if you didn't take over that the control of that. So thank you for that. My question it deals with the state police, and as a citizen taxpayer, it's such an embarrassment what's going on with the state police and their payroll and everything. Have you got plans to just let it continue this way, or revamp it or anything like that?
You thought the journalist questions were tough.
So first of all, there are a lot of good people who work for the state police, and they are horribly stained by the behavior of those who've been involved in this catastrophe. I give Colonel Gilpin, who's currently the colonel of the state police, a lot of credit for taking this investigation and running with it wherever it went. And in the end, she sent documented files on 46 troopers to the U.S. Attorney's Office and to the Attorney General. And each time one of those troopers either gets charged or pleads, they are getting charged or they are pleading based on the work that was done by Colonel Gilpin and her investigators to determine the size and breadth of this problem. Now, she responded to that when she realized how big it was by abolishing Troop E, which was the troop that managed the turnpike, which is where all this stuff came from. And she redeployed all of the troopers who were part of Troop E, which literally ran from one end of Massachusetts to the other, to the individual troops that dealt with what I would call or define as the state roads regionally in Massachusetts, and then required that everybody on a go-forward basis had to show up face-to-face to their supervisor before they went out on an overtime shift, and show up and turn in their papers face-to-face when they came back from one. The other thing she did was they do a quarterly audit now on overtime generally across the State Police, and she brought in Ernst & Young, which is a pretty well-known and highly respected accounting and financial services firm, to do a top-to-bottom financial, administrative, accounting, and operational review of the performance of the State Police generally. I think she's doing all the right things, and I believe that the work that will be done, especially by E&Y, will have significant opportunities for improvement going forward. But I have to repeat that I think the fact that when this investigation began under Colonel McEwen and then was accelerated under Colonel Gilpin, they didn't hesitate to submit that paperwork to the appropriate authorities for potential criminal prosecution, and it's happening. And I give them credit for sort of taking the bull by the horns and working to clean up their own shop. And I get the fact that every time one of these people gets arrested, people think, or pleads, people think it's new, but it's not. It's the follow-up work being done by the criminal investigations that were prompted by the work that was done by her team to actually collect the data associated with who had been engaging in falsifying this information previously.
Thank you.
So perennially, this region has a perception that it's not on Boston's radar screen. I think Western Massachusetts sometimes has the same complaint that state boards like Mass Development, Mass Cultural Commission, UMass in general, the CEC, don't have people from Greater New Bedford or South Coast on them. Do you think that there can be some improvements there, or is that just local provincial complaints?
So you mentioned the CEC and UMass Dartmouth and
UMass.
the Cultural Council, UMass period, and the Cultural Council. As I sit here, I don't think I'm smart enough to answer the question about geographic diversity. I will tell you, though, that we take geographic diversity very seriously when we make appointments, just as we take diversity, period, seriously. We should get him answers to those questions. I also take a lot of satisfaction in the fact that we appointed the first person to the SJC from Bristol County in 100 years when we put Ellie Cipher on the SJC. And we didn't put her there just because she was from Bristol County. She's a hell of a lawyer and a terrific judge, and has probably written most of the criminal code books here in the Commonwealth. I'm a huge fan. I think part of the reason the Lieutenant Governor and I created this community compact program was to force everybody to get out of the office and go spend time with their colleagues in local government around the Commonwealth. And she's been to all 351 cities and towns, many of them more than once. I've probably been to over 200. And it's translated into about 850 best practices worth of work on behalf of the 351 cities and towns. That's also why we recreated the Seaport Council, which had sort of gone away, because we kept hearing from our colleagues in local government along the coast that there really wasn't a forum for them to engage with the Commonwealth around discussions that mattered a lot with respect to waterfront, which for most folks in those 78 communities is their biggest economic and recreational asset, as well as their biggest environmental challenge. And the work associated with the MVP program, which I mentioned earlier, I think almost everybody in the South Coast has stepped up and participated with us on that. And that's really important stuff, and it's a constant reminder to us about the fact that different parts of the Commonwealth have different issues and different concerns that they need to address. I will get you the details on the exact questions you asked about geographic diversity, but I can tell you point blank that we take geographic diversity into account when we make appointments to boards and commissions. Sometimes it just doesn't fit with a particular board or commission, but I would argue that over the course of time, if you look at sort of where we pull people from on this stuff, it's a pretty broad spread around the Commonwealth.
What are you most proud of out of the community compacts?
The fact that all 351 cities and towns got into it, and that we literally have cities and towns at this point that call us up and say, so-and-so is working on this particular initiative, we think you should make it part of the program. I mean, cities and towns are now using it as a funnel into which they toss what they think are interesting ideas that they believe should be more broadly disseminated. When you get to the point where cities and towns are treating this as something they own and something that they see as a way for them to think smarter about how they do stuff, that's a terrific accomplishment, because historically a lot of them think state government's relationship to them is tell them what to do and not give them any money and, you know, not return their phone calls. And I don't feel like a lot of these folks feel that way about us. And I think it's one of the best parts about the work we've done on that stuff.
2 quick final questions.
Universal pre-K, do you support that? Do you see that happening? What do you see happening with that?
So we've put $110 million into early childhood ed since we took office. And a big part of that was about investing in the current system, because our concern was that the current system was not being properly supported and not doing it well on top of not doing much of it is an even worse situation than where we were. So a big part of our investment was not about expansion. A big part of our investment was about doing a better job of investing in the current early childhood ed system that we have. I really do believe the focus of that program should be in the same kinds of communities that we talked about previously around achievement and performance. I live in Swampscott. Almost all the kids in Swampscott are reading at grade level in 3rd grade, okay? They just are. And my bigger concern is that we get kids reading at grade level in the 3rd grade in places where less than half the kids are doing it now. So
But that pre-K is crucial.
yeah, right, which is why we made that $110 million. I mean, $110 million is the biggest investments those folks have seen in a really long time. But we didn't do what people thought we would do with it, which is invest $100 million and spread it out this way and not create a more robust system. What we said was, we're going to invest that $110 million in the folks who are currently in the business. We'll get a little bit of expansion out of it, but what we really want is to make the players who are currently in the space better at what they're doing. Because the big message we were hearing from most of them is, our big problem at this point is you, the Commonwealth, aren't supporting us at a level that makes it possible for us to do the work as well as we should be doing in the first place. So my view, we've made a big investment to sort of put them in a position where people feel like they're being adequately supported for the work they're doing now. And then going forward, the incremental investment will be targeted more to places where I believe it does the most good, which isn't necessarily all communities. It's going to be more like the kinds of communities that have issues with getting their kids to grade level in 3rd grade.
The New York wind turbine proposal, the New York State proposal, covers some of the prime scallop beds that you bet the fishermen.
Huge problem.
Fish.
Exactly.
Some estimate, which is 40% of the take at certain times of the year. So what, is that something that is already too far down the track, or is there anything that we can do to
We should get back to you on this, but I'm under the impression we can do a lot and that we're going to.
I understood the decision was to be made in October or November, so that was imminent, and they've already done their study.
There's a lot of points of attack on this one, irrespective of, quote, their decision, close quote.
Can you detail a few of them?
I talked to Secretary Beaton about this right after I saw Mayor Mitchell about a month and a half ago. And I don't want, this is an important one, I don't want to get it wrong. So, can we get back to you on that? I'm not trying not to answer the question. It's a hugely important issue. I want to make sure I know the latest before I speak to it.
I forget the agency that's overseeing it, but you've communicated with them already? Yeah.
But I think there's Yeah. Let's hustle on that one, Billy.
Hi, Jen Driscoll, our news editor, asked me to put in a question I haven't asked yet. What's your reaction to the indictment against the mayor of Fall River? Do you feel he should resign?
I said that I thought he should step aside while this is pending. I mean, it's a charge. He hasn't been found guilty of anything, but it's an enormous distraction. And I think it would be best for the council and the mayor to come up with some sort of arrangement that makes it possible for the city to continue to do its business while he worries about and deals with these pending charges.
Do you mean temporarily, not actually resign the position? Or?
Either step aside or I want them to figure out what the mechanism for it. I do think day to day having him in the job is just problematic. But I also don't want to head down the road where we're basically assuming the guy's guilty just because he's been charged. Now, that said, I do think for the sake of the city, he should step aside while this whole thing plays out.
Thanks very
I
much.
appreciate the chance. Thanks.
Thank you very much.